In this week's episode of Bleach the 1,000-Year Blood War, Byakuya suffers a devastating defeat at the hands of Äs Nödt. Kenpachi kills 3 Sternritter at once, and as Yamamoto avenges Chojuro, he begins to help the Soul Society turn the tables on their invaders. Yes, this week was yet another absolutely crazy episode of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc anime. I really appreciate the way they are building this crescendo of chaos that is the first Quincy invasion to a really effective degree. Throughout a lot of these episodes, you can really feel that building desperation that the Shinigami are finding themselves embroiled in, and it's only really been heightened with Ichigo being trapped inside the Garganta and the captains finally beginning to fight and fall as they take on the Sternritter. And despite a few nitpicks here and there, despite that pacing still marching forwards, I am absolutely loving everything they are showing us. And so, as we always do with our in-depth spoiler review and discussion, we'll be taking a look at this episode through the lens of someone who has read the source material in its entirety, so there will be full spoilers for the 1,000-Year Blood War arc to come as we take a look at what they've added, what they've changed, and yes, what they've taken away. And before we get started, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support for me another step further, we do also have a Patreon as well. And I just want to say a massive thank you and a huge shout out to everyone who is supporting me over there on Patreon. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. So we always begin these videos with a look and a breakdown at what exactly this week's episode actually covered in terms of the source material, in terms of the chapters. And as I predicted last week, we covered a lot of chapters this time, 6 chapters total, ranging from 500 to 505, and those chapters are as follows: 500, Rescuer in the Deep Dark; 501, Here, Fear, Here, easily one of the coolest chapter titles of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc; 502, Falling Sakura; 503, Wrath as a Lightning, which of course is what this episode is named after; 504, Beyond the Roaring Thunder; and then finally 505, The Fire. Interestingly, this is a unique situation where next week's upcoming episode is actually named after a chapter title from this week's episode, but it still works out as 506 and 507 are respectively called The Fire 2 and The Fire 3. But yeah, I can't say I'm at all surprised by this spate of chapters that is covered this week. The cliffhanger that we get at the end of this week's episode makes total sense. For the most part, anyway. There's a bit of weirdness with the end of this episode, which we'll get into a little bit later on. Now, last week I gushed over Kill the Shadow, claiming it was the best episode of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc so far, and I'm now rescinding that statement to update it by saying that Wrath as a Lightning is the new contender for the best episode of this new anime. I think it's absolutely fantastic, and it really kind of had everything that I wanted, everything that made the first invasion special, whether that was a brutal and terrifying beatdown of a beloved captain by a new fearsome opponent who, by the way, is handled so extraordinarily well in the anime. I cannot wait to get, of course, to the character of Äs. Whether that's to the desperation of Ichigo as he tries and struggles in vain to escape from the jail, as he's listening to his friends being butchered, as he's listening to the research and development department coming under attack from a usually friendly face, right the way down to the emotional stakes. Characters like Yamamoto reminiscing over Chojuro, that wonderful flashback that was really nicely brought to life. I really did like this episode for so many reasons. It felt here that they used their time really well. They didn't cut anything that was too egregious here, I don't think. Of course, as always, we'll go through everything that was cut in this week's episode, but actually I thought that they used their time well, and the stuff that they did add was either highly anticipated reveals and things that we actually wanted to see or to know, or stuff that is just I didn't expect to see, but I really did like, and it helped to flesh out what was already there. So, kicking off our spoiler analysis then, and as usual, I was wrong about my predictions regarding how I thought this episode would open. I kind of thought they would really trim down Chapter 500 and mostly remove the stuff involving the Research and Development Division. I knew they would keep things like Jidanbo attacking the division in because that's a pretty big deal, but I kind of thought they would skip over a lot of the Akon stuff, as much as I didn't want them to, because they removed a good chunk of of that last week, but actually 500 is here and fairly faithful. That being said, right from the get-go, they do cut an element of the chapter right away, and that's the involvement of the Raiteitai in the first invasion, which is a little bit of a shame, because I really like seeing all facets of the Gotei 13 getting involved as the situation escalates. Normally the Raiteitai, of course, members of an off-branch, essentially, of the Omnitsukido, are the ones who deliver communications throughout the Soul Society, and it was really cool seeing them deployed, taking that message, taking those communication swords from the 12th Division and distributing them around to the Shinigami in the middle of battle so that they can then relay information from the R&D Division. Instead, because we've completely cut the Raiteitai, all we see is those communication swords arriving at their destinations with no real idea of how they got there, but more criminally, in my opinion, we unfortunately lose a really badass scene for Robert Akutrome, where he simply pops one of the Raiteitai members without even looking at him, which I thought was always really awesome and unfortunately has been sacrificed. But other than that, we're not losing too much. Although Robert is somewhat short on badass moments after the end of the first invasion, so I imagine he would have taken whatever he could get. The many different reaction shots of the Shinigami learning that Ichigo is on his way, learning that his Bankai cannot be stolen by the Quincy, are all virtually the same, except they have cut the reaction shot of Yuki, which tells me that we have seen the last of these characters. This, I think, is the last appearance of Yuki in the manga itself, so it seems like those two rookie Shinigami are basically gone for good at this point. Instead, a Research and Development Division member gets a line that's effectively the same, basically just saying that when Ichigo arrives, that should signal a changing of the tides for us in this battle, and then Akon's moment where he has that realization that Ichigo's Reiatsu has vanished from the Garganta is exactly the same as it is in the source material. They do shuffle some parts around a little bit. We stay now with the Research and Development Division, whereas instead in the chapter itself we then cut back to Ichigo as he's trying desperately to communicate with these guys. Instead here we stay with them, which makes sense to me, as we watch as Jidanbo comes smashing in through the wall behind them, looking absolutely terrifying with those dead blank eyes as he looks down at his former allies and begins smashing them to pieces, just completely decimating the 12th Division. Now, while I do like this scene, it's a bit of a shame that they actually cut some of the confusion that ensues after this moment. Basically, everyone is kind of fleeing as Jidanbo is tearing the place up. Hyosu tries to lock the place down, at which point he tells Akon to flee, or else who will lead the scientists should Akon die. Firstly, it's just a nice small character moment for a character who is never really featured that much. Hyosu getting this little moment of selflessness is really cool, and it's also nice to show some camaraderie between the usually antisocial 12th Division members. But the part that we miss the most, in my opinion, is when Hyosu is then stabbed by Rin, who has no idea what he's doing. It's a really kind of dark and frightening moment, and it only adds to that confusion that we, the readers, and here, the viewers, would have felt as well. And perhaps most importantly about this moment is it's the most direct allusion to the Shrift, the love, that we would get until way, way, way later. And it actually makes a lot more sense with Pepe arriving after this scene than just seeing Jidanbo. Because at this moment, I think, to me at least, it looks like Jidanbo is being affected by the zombie rather than the love. But it's kind of hard to say either way. Despite them cutting that scene, you do actually hear Hyosu telling Akon to flee over the phone when Ichigo is listening in to the chaos. We do, however, get our first shot of Pepe Wakabrada, Sternritter L, a character I know you're all dying to see in the future when he comes and he's watching the destruction that Jidanbo is causing. We get his trademark geh laugh that we all used to call him by that name because that was all we knew of this character for so many years, it felt like. Interestingly, we do get a brand new shot here as well of his staff, Bechamel, on his shoulder. It's bright pink, which I think makes sense for his whole Cupid theme. It's actually kind of interesting that they chose to highlight the staff in this way. It feels like they're trying to say that it's the staff that's causing Jidanbo to attack the Research Division, but I'm not entirely sure that's the case. Also, Pepe's Quincy cross is actually located in the eye of that staff, so maybe that's another reason, or maybe they just wanted to show a little bit more of Pepe and kind of tease him out a little bit. At this point, we get a really effective scene where those communication swords begin to pick up on everything that's happening, including feedback from what's going on at the 12th Division itself, and the wires get crossed, and suddenly Ichigo can hear everyone. He's not just receiving information from Akon and the rest anymore, but he's able to hear people like Rukia, people like Renji actually out on the battlefield itself, as well as a myriad of other Shinigami, all of whom are screaming, crying out for their lives, all of whom are injured. It's a really great moment, in my opinion, that really plays on that protector nature of Ichigo. At the end of the day, that's all he's ever really wanted, is to be able to protect his friends, his family, those close to him, and that extends to the Soul Society as well. He now sees all of these guys as friends. It's like a second home in many ways, and so being trapped, being locked inside the Garganta, thanks to Kirige OP's jail, is really preying on Ichigo's mind as he can suddenly hear everyone talking in his head, effectively, as all of these Shinigami from all across the Seirete are crying out and dying. And it ends with Rukia being the one to say, "I know that Ichigo will be here soon to help us. Ichigo is coming. I know he is," which of course sends Ichigo into a crazed rage as he's desperately trying to break his way out of this cage. It's really effective, and I think that's a really difficult scene for them to adapt. It's done very faithfully here. It shows Ichigo as looking very small. I like the transition to black and white as the true kind of gravity, I think, of the situation in Soul Society sets into Ichigo's mind. I think they handled it really, really well here, and I think it was a difficult scene to get right. And so we really feel his desperation when Ichigo grabs his Zanpakuto and tries to break his way out of Kirige's jail, screaming at the top of his lungs, massive bursts of Reiatsu coming shooting out of the jail bars. It's really, really well done. And this is when we get the title card for the episode as well, and as I predicted last week, due to the fact that the Wrath as a Lightning title card doesn't appear until about halfway through this set of chapters, and is also not positioned in a particularly inventive way on the page either, just kind of vertically next to Kenpachi, I predicted that they wouldn't be able to do what they've done the last couple of weeks and create a chapter-accurate version of the title card, but I actually really do like what they've done, and in a cool detail, they're using the same font and coloration that the digitally coloured version of the manga uses, which is really, really awesome. After the intro plays, we're then treated to the cliffhanger scene of chapter 500 featuring Kirige, where he comments on Ichigo going on a rampage inside the Garganta. I love how rapidly Kirige just explodes with theatricality as he exclaims that His Majesty gave him the letter J, the jail, the very first shrift that we properly get to hear. And again, this scene plays out virtually identically to how it does in the source material, with only a couple of small differences in the presentation. For example, whatever the move is that kills Kirige, it looks different between this adaptation and the manga itself. In that original chapter, it really does look like Kirige is simply sliced in half from behind by a mysterious assailant, as there's this massive plume of Reiatsu that comes crashing down behind him. Whereas here in the anime, it really looks like he's instead split in half from something that is shot from above. It kind of looks like a Sero in the anime itself, but it might not be. I think it's lacking the traditional Sero sound effect, so maybe it is just a sword strike, but either way it does look slightly different. Either way, the result is the same, but some additional small details are that Chad and Orihime seem to actually be perfectly conscious in this scene in the anime. We get reaction shots from both of them, as well as Kisuke when Kirige is cut in half, and another nice new scene is that Kirige collapses to the ground, split in two in an undignified manner. It's a fitting end for one of the most pompous windbags in the series, but an amazing villain as well, and it's sad to see Kirige go. The next part of the episode is the beginning of chapter 501, as we see Ichigo surrounded by smoke inside his jail, as he's just tried to use a point-blank Getsuga Tensho to break himself free, but to his dismay he realises that even Getsuga can't free him, and it's a really great moment, again, really highlighting his struggles, his desperation to escape. There is a cut scene here. In the source material, Kubo was hyping up that cliffhanger from 500 where somebody arrived after killing Kirige, and it seemed like they weren't friendly as they held a sword to Kisuke's face, and Kisuke was unhappy to see them, to say the least. And Kubo was really building on that, moving into 501, teasing that figure's arrival as he has Kisuke's phone line disconnect from Ichigo inside the Garganta, and that was supposed to only hammer it home to us in the audience sense that something was going down. Unfortunately, none of that happens here in the episode. Byakuya and Renji then face Äs Nödt, and of course this was something I was really looking forward to seeing. Not only is Äs Nödt my second favourite of all the Sternritter, but this is one of the absolute highlights of the 1000-Year Blood War arc as far as I'm concerned. Byakuya is struck by one of Az's thorns in the exact same manner as the source material. He kind of darts backwards to put some distance between himself and the Quincy, but his conversation with Renji is slightly changed up. Firstly, Byakuya doesn't say that they shouldn't negate their numbers advantage by attacking Az at the exact same time, and secondly, they cut the comedic moment where Byakuya somewhat harshly says that he doesn't think Renji has the intellect necessary to lure out Az's abilities. Instead, there's actually a brand new line here where Byakuya says to Renji that his Bankai may be their last hope, which seems a little bit weird to me, since literally last week he said to Renji that he shouldn't use it at all for fear of it being stolen. But I can kind of see the thinking. If things get really bad, they do always have that option, whether it be stolen or not. As we move on to Äs Nödt's monologue regarding fear itself, I have to say that I'm really happy with how this character sounds, with how this character looks. As far as I'm concerned, everything regarding the presentation of Äs Nödt so far has been nearly spot on to everything I wanted. Back when I was reading the initial chapter when it came out weekly, when I first saw Az speak, my immediate thought was his voice is going to be extremely deep. However, later on, I kind of changed my opinion on that. When his mannerisms seemed to sort of change regarding his fight with Rukia, I thought maybe he has a sort of giddy, high-pitched, clown-like voice. But actually, they've kind of gone for something almost in between here, and he has this sort of raspy, eerie, kind of almost inhuman, but not quite. He still sounds enough like a man for it to be believable, but there is something darkly kind of monstrous going on behind that mask, and I think that they've done a really awesome job. He sounds honestly extremely cool. But his speech about fear is surprisingly, in my opinion, pretty much identical to how it is in the source material. Again, this was something I was kind of expecting them to trim down even just a little bit. And a really neat little detail is that when you see some flashbacks about Byakuya's life as a captain, they actually included a shot from the filler-only battle against Koga Kuchiki from the end of the Zanpakuto Rebellion arc, and that fight is absolutely amazing in the anime. If you haven't seen it, you absolutely should go and watch it. It really is incredible, and so I've got no problem with it being here. If anything, it's a nice little Easter egg. They cut out Äs Nödt's line, however, about were a normal Shinigami to be struck by his arrows, their heart would be engulfed and burst from the strain of the fear. And it's a little bit of a shame they got rid of that, because that's kind of Az's modus operandi. That's how he kills people. Later on in his battle with Rukia, he exclaims to her that her heart will explode from the fear that she is feeling. So it's just a tiny little thing at the end of the day, but it would have been cool to see it nonetheless. But the rest of their conversation, the rest of their fight is extremely faithful, right the way down to Az commending Byakuya for having held off the fear to this point, right the way through to Az being like, but it's only temporary, you know, you will fall to it eventually. Basically, all of that sort of thing that he says is exactly the same as it appears in the original chapter. And I do love, for the most part, how this battle is portrayed. I love that moment of Byakuya trying to swing at Az, and Az's eyes looking bulbous and enormous as he says that Byakuya's heart has already succumbed to fear of Az himself. I think all of that looks absolutely fantastic. And then, of course, after this moment, we get one of the moments I think people were absolutely the most excited to see, maybe even the most apprehensive to see, because it could have been pretty easy, I think, to mess this up. If they had held back in any way, it would have absolutely lost some of its impact and some of its effectiveness. But they don't. And because of that, we get an amazing representation of Az's ability. Byakuya, of course, tries to rationalize the fear that he is feeling. He sees Rukia in front of him. She turns a smile on her face when suddenly her face melts. She decays right in front of him. An eyeball falls out. Her teeth are all cracked and broken. And she looks like a zombie. She is a corpse right in front of him. And it is so dark. It is so gruesome that it is perfect. It works incredibly well. There is a sickly, evil-looking red and black background. It's a wonderfully done scene and a great representation of the fear. Had this Thousand Year Blood War arc been in the original anime, I can only begin to imagine what that scene would have looked like. Maybe they wouldn't have even shown it properly, I have no idea. They might have done one of those things where they do like a silhouette instead to kind of hide the gore that's taking place, but this sort of body horror is endemic to making Äs Nödt work as a character, and I think they nailed it here. Maybe it could have done with like a jump scare sound effect to really hammer it home that this is something Byakuya is suddenly seeing as his eye grows wide in horror. But otherwise, I'm extremely pleased with how this has turned out. I also think the shot of the flies crawling all over Byakuya is extremely well handled. I love their little red eyes, that makes them look even creepier than they do before, and I love that kind of sensation of them marching towards him as though they are an embodiment of Äs Nödt's the fear itself, watching them climb all over Byakuya's body, going into his mouth, and suddenly he shakes them off with this almost feral scream that is so uncharacteristic of Byakuya himself. Really just fantastic to watch, just as engrossing and engaging as it was when it originally came out. As Byakuya just roars in terror, there's a nice, fluid, extended sequence of him swiping in vain at as just kind of casually ducks and dodges out of the way before leaping up into the air to activate the stolen Bankai. I mean, I've talked about this scene, I think, at least a couple of times on the channel in the past, but there's a reason it is so memorable among fans. It is like nothing we had ever seen before. Byakuya is one of these characters who is such an infallible mainstay of the series that he always manages to find a way to come out of even the worst situations. So for this to occur, to see Byakuya reduced to this screaming mess as he is eviscerated, will never not be powerful. We then get a nice brand new sequence of Äs actually activating Bankai. We see him standing there with his arms outstretched as the swords have risen up behind him. That is so eerie to see. It's really cool watching as Byakuya and Renji look on in horror as the Bankai activates, as Senbon Sakura Kageyoshi activates. The anime team made a really smart decision, in my opinion, having a sort of mocking reversal of Byakuya activating Bankai and having that same animation play out, but this time with the roles reversed, having Äs rise up as Senbon Sakura appears behind him, having it close in on Byakuya's face as he looks on in terror. It's, in my opinion, really well done and actually pretty clever. As Rukia notices that lone petal and Byakuya collapses before Äs, that signals the end of chapter 501. As the episode moves into chapter 502, we get a beginning that's mostly, again, exactly the same. Byakuya collapses to the floor as Äs taunts him. Renji leaps into the air, attempting to jump Äs Nödt. After this, however, we get another highly anticipated scene for manga readers, as Rukia, realizing that Byakuya has fallen in battle, leaves her fight and attempts to run to his aid. First off, it's a ridiculous decision on her part. I get the emotions are welling up inside of her and she felt a desperate need to go to his side, but she is currently facing off against a Sternritter of her own, and I like that said Sternritter doesn't let her escape. Now, in the original source material, we had no idea who it was that Rukia came up against, despite that character actually talking to her in this moment. And a lot of people were really hopeful that we would see who it was. Kubo revealed in a club outside Q&A that we would, and it turns out that the Sternritter Rukia is facing is P the Power Meninas McCallum. Honestly, this makes total sense to me. For the longest time, many of us thought it was Giselle that Rukia was up against, but actually this does make way more sense. As if Rukia were up against kind of anyone else, they would have killed her outright in some kind of grotesque fashion. Giselle would have zombified her, little Toto would have eaten her. It therefore makes sense with Meninas, where her power is effectively just superhuman strength, that she would knock Rukia out and then effectively leave her be. But in my opinion, I think that works really, really well. It's really awesome that we actually get to see her talking and then running Rukia down. I actually really like the next little sequence between Äs Nödt and Renji as well, as I feel like it makes more sense here in the anime than it did in the original chapter, or at the very least it's a little bit clearer as to what's actually going on. In the original chapter, it kind of looks like Renji just sort of clashes with Äs, then activates Zabimaru in contact with his arm, at which point Äs blocks the tip of Zabimaru with Senbon Sakura before throwing it at Renji. Here in the anime, they have simplified it, I think, to make it more obvious what's happening, and I actually do like that. Basically, Renji just tries to entrap Äs in Zabimaru again, but Äs leaps out of it and then sends Senbon Sakura towards him, at which point Renji blocks it. I think that works perfectly fine as far as I'm concerned. And of course, next we get the devastating sequence where Byakuya attempts to stand to his feet, his body already shredded and covered in blood, but Äs Nödt turns and viciously, remorselessly, just destroys him with his own Bankai, absolutely engulfs Byakuya in a torrential tempest, a maelstrom of petals, shredding Byakuya from head to toe as he kind of collapses backwards, his eyes white before he staggers forwards, only to be hit again by a rainfall of petals that send him flying into the wall behind, as Renji can only look on in utter horror. This is one of my favourite sequences in the entire series, that sense of utter helplessness that the good guys feel, that they rarely ever feel, is encapsulated so well in this moment. And I think the anime, for the most part, absolutely does it justice. I think there are a lot of things that work really well here. I think the lighting is great, that kind of purple glow that is covering everything that would usually be a symbol of Senbon Sakura that is now given that kind of darker tint, that more evil edge that makes this whole scene feel like a bad dream. That being said, I can't help but feel like this scene is missing some of that impact, some of that brutality that I wish it had. But it doesn't really feel like Byakuya is being shredded, like completely eviscerated by thousands upon thousands of blades all at once. There are a couple of scenes that I think maybe they should have left in. There's one shot of his arm almost like reaching out of Senbon Sakura itself that I wish they'd kind of kept in, because it really shows that he can't do anything. He is being almost suffocated by this wall of blades. Other than that, though, I think this sequence is handled really well. You get that great moment where Renji screams at Az, runs towards him, attempts to activate Bankai, only to be grabbed by Master Masculine and booted halfway across Seirete. And it's really good as well, I think, actually getting to see Renji going so far. Like, he smashes into the wall of that building they're fighting on, and then just carries on out into the middle of Seirete itself. It's another really, really good scene. It's a difficult one. Again, it's one that fans have been really waiting for with bated breath, and for the most part, I think they did a good job. When you get that sort of seminal shot of Byakuya slumped in the wall, there is a sort of silence. There's a heavy silence that I think does work really well. The scene has been changed up ever so slightly. Some of the gore has been removed. Byakuya has lost his arm like he has in the original chapter. However, here you can't see his rib cage, like he hasn't been reduced to a near skeleton in this moment. I don't think that's censorship, however. What I think they're doing here is actively trying to downplay his injuries a little bit so that people don't think he's dead this time. That's genuinely what I think they're doing. I think that's exactly why they then remove Hashwolf's line about, I think Byakuya Kuchiki has died. They've got rid of all of that, because I think they're just basically trying to show that this is a serious near-death defeat, not that Byakuya has actually succumbed to his injuries, because there was a bit of controversy about that back in the day. But Byakuya's thoughts as he sort of slips in and out of unconsciousness are exactly the same here as they are in the original chapter. His sword snaps and breaks, and he apologises to Renji and Rukia. It's really nicely handled, and I have to say, like, I do have to tip my hat, I think, to the anime team. For the most part, I think they did a really good job here, getting across Az's ruthlessness, getting across the fact that Byakuya was totally helpless, taking some direct shots from the original chapter itself and incorporating them here in ways that I think worked really well. Really, the only thing I would have changed is maybe up to the tempo on the soundtrack, perhaps, when Byakuya is actually getting eviscerated, only to cut it out at the very end. I do like the quiet when he is buried in the wall, and I would have maybe tried to, I don't really know how, but somehow upped that feeling of brutality, that impact when Byakuya is actually getting shredded. Maybe it means more blood, maybe it means more of a focus on Byakuya himself actually within his own Bankai. Either way, I am pretty happy with this scene, one of the most important scenes of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. Not only did they cut Hashwolf's line about Byakuya dying, but that whole brief conversation that he has with Yhwach is completely gone, and they also remove that sensation of Reiatsu that alerts them to Zaraki's presence, which again is a little bit weird. Obviously, Yhwach and Hashwolf at this point in the story are on the same level, if not leagues above where Zaraki is at this moment, so maybe it was done because they wouldn't really be fazed by that, but in the original chapter, Hashwolf is like genuinely shocked by the appearance of Kenpachi. And I notice a few people in the comments have brought up the overall seeming disappearance of that spiritual pressure sensation, which I would like to see make a return. Otherwise though, Zaraki's appearance is very similar to how it is in the source material. He has all 3 of the Sternritter that he has killed on his back. It is a triumphant moment. Again, I'm surprised though that it's not given a little bit more prominence, that it's not a bit more of a shock factor moment. It's supposed to be that morale-boosting moment after Byakuya is nearly killed, that Zaraki stomps onto the scene, 3 of the enemy's elite warriors on his shoulder, and then he dumps them unceremoniously on the floor. Either way, though, I do still like how this is done. And once again, the anime adds another sequence that we really wanted to see. That is giving these 3 Sternritter some semblance of a fight. Now, they were never going to get too much, because in the original chapter, they get maybe a panel apiece, but here we get a decent showing for all 3 of them. I mean, it's really not much, don't get me wrong, but it's pretty much what I was hoping for. I love seeing Jerome transform into that massive monster and then bursting the heads of the Shinigami around him, only to then be sliced in half by Zaraki. I love seeing Berenice trying to talk to Zaraki with this cocky grin on his face, only to have his throat completely just pulled out. And it's also really awesome seeing Lloyd transform into Zaraki, and again, getting a small fight between the 2 of them. It's a bit of a shame that they cut out Zaraki's line about not actually being able to hear Berenice because of Jerome's roar, because I always thought that was really funny. I always think it's a really good moment that Zaraki just wasn't affected by the question at all, because he couldn't even hear what was going on. Whereas here, it just kind of seems like Berenice's ability is completely useless. Either way, these Sternritter go down in exactly the same manner they did before, but it's really cool that we actually get to see these brief glimpses of them actually engaged in a battle. But then Zaraki clashes with Yhwach in exactly the same way they do in the original chapter, which looks awesome. I love seeing Zaraki running towards him, bringing his blade down, Hashwolf shouting out for Yhwach, but the Quincy King simply grinning, smirking as he only lifts his arm to block against Zaraki's blade. Then we're back with Ichigo raging inside the prison. We see him just smashing against the bars, trying to break free to no avail. Nice little detail, there are some small chips on Tensa Zangetsu's blade, which is really, really cool. We see those slithers of Quincy Reiatsu being drawn into Ichigo, which is of course important for later on. Then we get a brand new scene of the R&D department building that almost like exit terminal for Ichigo to eventually come out of once they force that doorway open. That's really nice. It's really cool to see them setting that up before we get that eventual reveal when Ichigo escapes the Garganta later on down the line. It's nice seeing Hyosu bringing Akon as well. They've both obviously survived Jidanbo's attack, but they are looking a little worse for wear. A part of me does wonder if they will even include Shaz Domino. Of course, by the time Ichigo breaks free of the Garganta thanks to Akon's help, Shaz has been systematically picking off the members of the division that are there in that terminal, and then Ichigo just attacks him the moment he arrives in Soul Society. But because of Shaz's fate, because of his involvement in the light novels, because the fact of him existing without the light novels doesn't really make sense, I do wonder if he'll be included here at all. Then, as we do in the original chapter, we move over to the 9th Division where Hisagi is confronting Driscoll Berci, Sternritter O, who, as I mentioned in my live reaction, looks so much better here in this episode than he did in his first appearance, where it just showed a brief panel of him approaching Hisagi. Here he looks pretty much identical to how he does in the source material. One little detail in that original chapter that I never noticed until now is that when Driscoll stomps on the body of one of the Shinigami, you can see in the next panel that he kind of scrapes him off his shoe like dirt on the ground. I mean, that's pretty dark, and it kind of encapsulates Driscoll and his kind of contempt for life as a whole. But all of this sequence with Driscoll and Hisagi is basically shot for shot identical to how it appears in that original chapter, with Hisagi slammed into a wall as there's nothing he can do against this massive enemy. Driscoll revealing that he is the one who killed Sasakibe before using his spirit weapon to summon a massive lance, the same that impaled Sasakibe, before launching it at Hisagi. Usagi, only for Yamamoto to arrive at the last minute and defend him. This is all basically exactly the same. I love Driscoll laughing his head off maniacally as he reveals that he came to fight Yamamoto using Sasakibe's Bankai. It's great, you know, it's all really, really well done. You know, you have to think, Driscoll, you have picked the complete wrong person to annoy, and I just think all of this sequence is actually handled extraordinarily well. But of course, Driscoll announcing that he will use Sasakibe's Bankai to finish off Yamamoto signals the end of chapter 503. And as we move into chapter 504, this chapter is of course centered around that emotional flashback between Yama and his vice captain. Of course, this begins by showing us Chojuro activating his Bankai Koko Gonryu Rikyu just like he does in the manga, except here they fix that issue that we had with the digitally coloured version. The digitally coloured version showed Sasakibe using a purple Bankai. The lightning that he used was purple, despite the fact that Koko Gonryu Rikyu means twinkling yellow lightning palace. Now, this wouldn't be the first time that a name hasn't corresponded to the correct colour. For instance, Harabel uses an attack called Ola Azul, which actually turns out to be yellow. However, it's really nice that they took the effort to not only correct this, but also include the purple version of the Bankai as a kind of acknowledgement that Driscoll is not the real owner. Of course, we saw this briefly in episode 1 when we got that flash of gold light when Sasakibe used his Bankai, but it's really cool seeing it actually brought to life here. Hisagi's thoughts regarding Sasakibe's Bankai are all the same. Driscoll blasts Yamamoto with a bolt of purple lightning. By the way, Koko Gonryu Rikyu looks amazing here in the anime. I love the visual effects for it. It looks fantastic. And of course, this leads nicely into our flashback, where we see a much younger Yamamoto and a considerably younger Chojuro having one of their regular meetings where Chojuro is like this annoying gnat to Yamamoto, constantly buzzing around him, constantly trying to become his right-hand man. And we see a slightly sterner but still forgiving Yamamoto who doesn't have time for this man's nonsense. But it's handled again really, really nicely. It looks stunningly pretty as far as I'm concerned. I love the colours on show here, that beautiful emerald green willow tree. Everything about this scene looks wonderful. However, while their conversation is virtually identical, we get a brand new scene, an extension of an older scene which was basically just 2 panels in the original chapter, where Chojuro and Yamamoto have their clash, where Yamamoto says, "Use your Bankai that you have just gained to try and defeat me." And we actually get to see Chojuro try and do just that. In the original chapter, it basically cuts straight to the moment where Yamamoto has this huge injury on his head, and much like the Meninas reveal, and much like the small but effective inclusion of the battles Zaraki has against the Sternritter, this is another fantastic and valuable addition by the anime. It's really awesome getting to see Sasakibe himself using his Bankai and using it well. It was always a bit of a shame that Sasakibe never got to use his own Bankai. We only really saw it through the conduit that was Driscoll, and so something always felt a little bit off about that. Of course, Sasakibe, we see him activating it through Yamamoto's kind of memory, but here it's really awesome seeing him using it for real. What's great about this is not only does the Bankai look amazing in this golden colour, but it's so awesome seeing Sasakibe using it in a way that I would never have imagined him using it. He creates that almost bird cage of lightning that we get to see, but he draws Gonryu through the rods of lightning, collecting them on the end of his sword, building up his charge, his attack power, before lunging for Yamamoto as almost like a singular bolt of lightning. It's really clever, really awesome, and shows that even at such an early stage, Sasakibe was on a totally different level to using his own Bankai that Driscoll could probably ever hope to achieve. And I love that. In the original chapter, Yamamoto scolds Driscoll, saying that Sasakibe's Bankai was never this weak, and so we always kind of assumed that Driscoll obviously wasn't able to use it to its fullest potential, but it's really cool seeing that even such a young Sasakibe who has only just learned this Bankai is utilising it in a different way to Driscoll himself, who seems to be using it on a much more surface level and simplistic way. The imagery of Sasakibe racing towards Yamamoto, surrounded by lightning, seems to be foreshadowing and designed to reflect the imagery we'd get later in this episode of Yamamoto blasting through the sky surrounded by fire, which again is really awesome. And when you put those shots side by side, you see just how monstrously powerful the First Division's leadership actually was. But as the flashback ends, you get a nice kind of extension of the scene at the end of the flashback where Yamamoto creates his new name, Genryusai. You see him writing it down. It's really, really good. Really, really good stuff. Really emotional, and it works really well. I think they handled this flashback fantastically. Back in the present day, the anime cuts the scene where Hisagi thinks that Yamamoto has fallen unconscious and prepares to rush to his aid, only for Yamamoto to tell him to stay right where he is. That being said, as if to compensate for that, the anime slightly changes up the scene where Yamamoto vaporizes Driscoll in a way that I think is actually more effective. Not only do we have an incredible soundtrack on the top of this, the moment Yamamoto unleashes Ryujin Jaka and torches Driscoll to a crisp, but actually they change it up to make it even more menacing, I think. Rather than simply standing still on the spot and striking Driscoll like he does in that original chapter, Yamamoto actually approaches Driscoll, again in a very menacing way, a very challenging and threatening way, and I really liked that as he's talking about how Chojuro must be feeling great anguish and pain, seeing how weak his Bankai is being used. And then of course you also see that Yamamoto kind of sheds his captain's Hayori, whereas he's still wearing it at the moment he strikes Driscoll in the original chapter. And again, I really like this, as it feels like a visual representation of the idea that Yamamoto is casting off his duty as a captain and is instead killing Driscoll out of pure emotional rage and hatred. And as we begin chapter 505, Yamamoto annihilates Driscoll Berci. We get to see Driscoll's face, his body reduced to nothing but bone, and then that bone turned to ash, thanks to the force of Yamamoto's strike. Again, another of these moments that absolutely wouldn't have been as effective had it been censored in any way, but this just looks fantastic. It looks crazy. It's a real symbol of Yamamoto's strength, but also the vengeance that he sought for his dear friend Chojuro. Swearing to kill all of the rebel soldiers by his own hand, Yamamoto propels himself through the air like a volcanic eruption, blasting into the sky and tearing across the Seirete, alerting everyone to his presence, alerting everyone to the fact that Yamamoto is not only seething with anger, but on the front lines. Omaida is cut from Soifon's moment of recognition when she realizes that Yamamoto is enraged, but other than that, the rest of those moments where the Shinigami realize what's going on are exactly the same. There is one line missing, and it's Shinji's line to Momo where he tells her that if they don't hurry and show what they can do, Yamamoto might steal all the glory for himself. And in my opinion, it makes total sense that the animators would cut this line for Shinji, as they know full well that he's not really going to get any scenes to show what he can do at all. I definitely feel like we've got a bit of a running joke at this point about how Shinji is effectively useless in this arc, but it's not my fault. It's pretty much just how it goes for him. And now the anime team are actively taking away lines where he claims he's about to do something. The Toshiro and Rangiku scene, again, is basically the same right the way down to actually showing us Kangdo's face. He looks fantastic. And the Komamura scene where he revitalizes the 7th Division through his howl, through his commanding words, is again basically exactly the same, and they kept Bambietta's wonderful comedic moment as well. And now we're at the end of the episode, which in my opinion is kind of weird. It is handled strangely, I think, the end of this episode, because it doesn't end where I thought it would, but then it kind of does. So the episode's actual cliffhanger is Kyoraku racing towards Robert Akutrone, about to slice him, as he has also had his morale lifted by Yamamoto entering the battlefield, saying that Yamamoto would be angry with him not having raised him to struggle against characters of this caliber. It's a wonderful moment, it's an awesome sequence in the chapter itself, but it feels weird as a cliffhanger. Not only is this not the end of a chapter, it's about 3/4 of the way through, it feels artificial. When I was watching the episode, I thought my internet had cut out. I wasn't expecting it to end there at all. It's very, very abrupt, and it feels a little bit odd to me, especially considering They then keep the actual end of 505, which is really weird. I don't know why it's after the credits and why it wouldn't have just fared better as the actual cliffhanger of the episode itself. But yes, speaking of that moment, after the credits we do get the actual cliffhanger to chapter 505, where Yhwach is holding up Zaraki by the throat, and as he prepares to destroy Soul Society, Yamamoto lands behind him in an incredible reflection of one of the most amazing panels of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, one of the most amazing pages of that arc, where we see Yamamoto just crash land like a meteor behind Yhwach, his swirling flames around him, looking absolutely phenomenal and ferocious, and Yamamoto approaches him almost entirely cloaked in shadow from the overbearing wall of flame behind him as he says, "It's been 1,000 years, hasn't it? Yhwach." We get the first proper read of our main villain's name, and he says that he has come to take his life, as the Quincy King turns to him with this wicked grin on his face. It's a great ending. I don't know why they didn't use it as the actual ending of the episode, but either way, it's fantastically well done. It sets the stage for an incredible battle to come. I love the lighting, the orange glow on Yhwach's face as he is just facing down Yamamoto's torrent of fire. Yamamoto himself looking in many ways like a shadow of the man he was at the start of the arc. His outfit just torn and ripped, and he looks like he is just hell-bent on his quest for revenge. All of this looks absolutely amazing and is absolutely the correct place to end episode 5. And then after this, we're still treated to a preview poem for next week, this one being for Yamamoto. It's pretty simplistic. It says, "The heart burns even as the rain falls." This seems to be referencing a couple of things, mostly how Yamamoto was able to inspire the Shinigami to get back up onto their feet, how he was able to inspire them to continue fighting even when faced with the worst odds. But of course, it's also referencing Yamamoto's impending doom next week, or potentially the week after. We'll get into that in a minute. That panel of his foot used for the poem here is of course taken from the moment of his death, and the rainfall only begins once Yamamoto lets up and relinquishes his Bankai, which of course also signals that he's about to be killed. So this is a poem that seems optimistic, talking about the heart burning, even though the rain falls, but we know of course that there is a much darker side to this poem that really heralds doom. And so that's it for another amazing episode of the 1,000-Year Blood War. As I think hopefully I showcased in this video, there were some things cut this week, but overall I think the additions more than made up for it and really helped bring everything to life, and also just gave us things we had really been wanting to see. I loved getting the Meninas reveal. I loved seeing Jerome, Berenice, and Lloyd actually getting a small snippet of a fight. I loved seeing Chojuro actually using his own Bankai. So much worked so well this week for me. Even though the cliffhanger was a really odd decision, I think, for the most part, they then make up for it anyway by having the real cliffhanger after the credits. So I don't really know what that's all about. Now, seeing as it's the first week that we've lost a member of the Sternritter, it's time to introduce a brand new segment to our in-depth reviews. Sternritter in Memoriam. Now, this time we've actually lost a grand total of 5 Sternritter in one fell swoop. The first one to go is Sternritter J, the Jail Kirge Opie, an amazing villain and someone who hung around for a good chunk of episodes, and we're all sad to see him go. However, the other Sternritter to leave us are going almost as fast as they appeared. First, we've got Sternritter O, the overkill Driscoll Berci, roasted by Yamamoto. He actually appeared very briefly in a previous episode, so at least that's something, but the other 3 to go all died in the very same episode they first appeared. Sternritter Q, the Question Berenice Gabrielli, Sternritter R, the Raw Jerome Guizba, and Sternritter Y, the Yourself Lloyd. I'm sure we'll be losing more Sternritter in the weeks and months to come, but these are the first 5 to be killed off in the 1,000-Year Blood War. Regarding my predictions then for next week, episode 6, The Fire. Oh, I wonder what's going to happen. I've got no idea. Oh yeah, the fight between Yamamoto and Yhwach, who of course we know to be Sternritter Y, Lloyd. And I've seen people commenting saying they hope the end of that fight is changed. As much as I would like it to be as well, I think there is a Zero chance of that happening, unfortunately. Now, I think this episode will open in one of two ways. It'll either open with the immediate beginning of chapter 506, which should be the direct follow-on from our cliffhanger this week, where Kyoraku slices Robert across the chest, at which point Robert says, it's good that your morale has increased. However, our spirits are also lifted when our boss fights, at which point 3 Sternritter attempt to jump Yamamoto. So I could see it starting right there, or I could see them doing a very brief recap of the post-credits scene from this week. Honestly, I could totally see that. Maybe as like a fail-safe in case people didn't watch beyond the credits. They could open with Yhwach holding Kenpachi aloft and doing that moment again. I'm not entirely sure. More importantly, where will this episode end? I think unlike this week, which covered 6 chapters, next time we might only get 5, because in my opinion, I think it is better to end it with the ending of chapter 510. The real Yhwach has returned to the battlefield, and with a devilish grin on his face as Yamamoto looks completely spent and defeated, Yhwach cuts him down. However, we then wait a week to really see the effects of that, to see the brutal gut punch that is the result of that moment. Personally, that's the ending I would go with for next episode, because it then means you can open episode 7 right into the flashback with Yamamoto and Kyoraku when he's a child, and I think that would be really, really effective. The other potential ending here, of course, is that they do go the 6-chapter route again and actually end it with that moment where there's an explosion in the air behind Yhwach, signalling the arrival of Ichigo. I think that would also be good. I think they could potentially choose either, but personally I would go with ending it with 510 as well, so that we don't have to cram Yamamoto's emotional death into the end of the episode. At the end of the day, though, next week should be absolutely monumental. There's no denying it. We should get a truly amazing spectacle of a fight between 2 titanic powers. Particularly, we will get the showcase of Yamamoto's Bankai Zanka no Tachi. Regarding what they might cut from next week's episode, as far as I'm concerned, they don't really need to cut anything. It being a fight almost predominantly means they can get through scenes decently quickly if they need to. If anything, I'm hoping they add more rather than take away here, because this is really our first proper, and I'm hesitant to say proper because it does a disservice to battles like Ichigo versus Kirige and Byakuya versus Äs, but this is our first proper fight of the arc that spans multiple chapters in succession. And so because of that, I think they can easily make this the entire episode without having to remove anything, but that is me being optimistic. If anything, if they're going to add in small scenes, I would like to see them do something where maybe they show Bazby quickly attempting to defend himself and the other Sternritter when Yamamoto attacks them, just so their survival doesn't come out of nowhere. I also wonder if next week might try and give us a definitive answer on when Yhwach and Lloyd swapped places, or if they ever did at all. Maybe they'll save that for episode 7, but even if they end this with 510, we'll still see Lloyd in the end of this episode no matter what. So I would love to see that. Maybe we just see Yhwach giving Lloyd the order personally before they make their invasion, telling him, you need to go and confront Yamamoto, and then we see that it has been Lloyd from the very beginning. He was the one who took down Kenpachi, but I'd love to see them try and alleviate a bit of the speculation surrounding that. But that's it for this video on episode 5, Wrath as a Lightning. I really hope you enjoyed it, guys. Let me know in the comments below what your favourite moment from this episode was. There's a ton to choose from, and I cannot wait for episode 6, The Fire. But yeah, that's everything for me on episode 5, guys. Like I said, I really hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done that already. And also, again, a massive thank you to everyone supporting me over on Patreon. And until next time, guys, I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.